So about a week ago on Instagram, I posted this post comparing superheroes' origin stories to various soteriological positions in Christianity. Now, if you don't know what any of those words mean, I'm going to explain them all in this video. Hopefully this video will be able to be used as kind of a learning opportunity for folks who are unfamiliar with a lot of the different debates on salvation within Christianity. So by debate on salvation, what do I mean? Well, the term soteriology, which means theology of salvation, often has to do with the how we get saved in relation to the decision of God. And we'll be talking a lot about that here. But the Bible, in one sense, is very clear that we are saved by grace. God elects us in such a way that we cannot boast about how we are saved. Although it also seems like God has this universal will that all should be saved. And so theologians have been dealing with the complexities of those two positions. And I won't be arguing for any positions in this video. I'm simply just going to be articulating the variety of views that have emerged within Christian theology. And then comparing them to superheroes' origin stories. Why do I think this is helpful? Well, superheroes are moral figures, right? And so in the same sense that when we are justified, we become more righteous, we become more like Christ over time once we're saved, right? So superheroes also have this moral quality to them, but they also usually have an origin story or a reason why they are, super powered, we might say. And so there's a lot that can overlap with the Christian explanations for how we are saved, right? In the analogy that I'm going to be drawing today, it's going to be how these superheroes got their powers in their own origin stories, can often explain how different Christians view how we get saved. All right, so without further ado, let me just get into the explanations. Now, one of the more common views today, especially in American Protestantism, is a position largely called Calvinism, although you can find predecessors to Calvinism before Calvin. Obviously, even within the Reformation, Calvin was not a first-generation reformer, but a second-generation reformer. But it's largely come to be called Calvinism. You can go online and you can find acronyms to explain Calvinism like TULIP. But in this, I'm going to try to explain Calvinism with Superman and Spider-Man. What do I mean by this? Well, Superman and Spider-Man received their powers completely outside of their control, completely by grace alone. They didn't do anything to earn their powers. They didn't have a quality in them that made them deserving of their powers. In fact, especially in the story of Spider-Man, before he has his powers, he's kind of a no-good, and once he gets his superpowers, he abuses them. He uses them wrongly to try to make money for himself. And in the original Spider-Man story, right, he has this opportunity to do something he knows is right with his superpowers. He fails to do it, and he suffers immensely. And he tragically loses his uncle because he failed to do the thing he knew was right to do with his powers. And so instead, Superman is also similar to this. Superman didn't earn his powers. He was just born a Kryptonian, and then because of the fact that Superman is now on Earth, and he has a different colored sun, and all the internal nerdy lore of Superman, which we'll be definitely talking a lot about nerd lore of superheroes a lot in this video, but because of that, Superman is super powered, but he didn't do anything to get those powers. It's an accident of his birth. Despite this, the characters don't take their superpowers for granted. They still use their superpowers for good, and they, out of a sense of obligation, they still do what is right, even though they don't have to earn their powers. The famous line of Spider-Man, which is, "With great power comes great responsibility," is a summary of how Calvinists would explain why we have to do good works. So Calvinists, or double predestinarians, more broadly, the Reformed, as they've been called, would say God doesn't choose us for salvation because of anything we do. He doesn't even foresee some redeeming quality in us. He just picks some people to be saved. And this comes off as arbitrary to others, but the Calvinists would say nobody deserves to be saved, and so it is purely by grace, or an unmerited decision, that God picks some people to save out of the kindness of his heart. He has no obligation to do this with anybody, and yet saves some from their sins. The rest of the world, although, is free to do whatever they want, and in their freedom, they often, and almost always, choose the wrong things, and have sins that they need to make up for, but they fail to make up for on their own. And so for those people, God just simply doesn't elect them, and they wallow in their own sins, as opposed to other people who God gives grace that they might be saved and unites them to Christ, imputes Christ's righteousness to them, and sees them with Christ's righteousness. And then slowly those people become like Christ because of the salvation experience God gave them, even though they didn't deserve it. And so lots of people will see Calvinists and they say, well, why would you do good works? It doesn't have anything to do with your salvation. You're not earning your salvation. Why would you do good? And the Calvinists would say, well, out of a love of God, a love for God, that I should just appreciate the gift I've been given and do what is right with what I've been given from God by grace. And in that way, it's kind of like with great power comes great responsibility. Okay, so what are the alternative views to Calvinism? Well, the main alternative that people will point out as the kind of opposite position would be the Arminian position. Arminius was a Dutch theologian who was in the Dutch Reformed Church. The Dutch Reformed Church was very Calvinistic, and so Arminius opposed this and articulated an alternative view. And in Arminianism, people are predestined, because the Bible is clear that people are predestined unto salvation, but Arminius would have argued that it is the response of the person to grace that everybody receives, and that response, even though they don't deserve that initial act of grace, is what makes some people saved and other people not saved. So the other way of articulating this is that basically the predestined are predestined based off of a foreseen response to faith. That God knows who will react well and knows who will react with ingratitude towards grace. And so still without grace, in the Arminian view, nobody would be saved. We'd all be wallowing in our sins. It would be like what are called the reprobate in the previous Calvinist version. But instead, God gives sufficient grace to everybody, which means that everybody is, if you don't respond to the grace that God has given you, you are extra liable and extra guilty. In the superhero analogy, I think a good analogy for Arminianism would be Captain America. Why do I say Captain America? Well, Captain America received his powers because Dr. Erskine is the World War II scientist who invents a super serum, finds Captain America, who's actually a scrawny, undeserving, right, not a superhero, sees that he has a certain kind of moral strength that a lot of the other candidates to become super soldiers do not have, and he knows that if he gave the super soldier serum to anybody else, they would react negatively, but instead knows that within the young, weak Steve Rogers, that he has the moral character necessary to make good use of the super soldier serum, and so he gives the super soldier serum to Captain America, Steve Rogers. And so Captain America was, before his powers, able to do nothing. He was not a superhero. Because of a completely gratuitous donation from a benefactor, he suddenly became capable of being a superhero, and then lives out that response to that superpower by being a superhero, because Dr. Erskine knew that's how he would react to that. Okay, another view that is parallel to the conversations we've been having right now. So these are basically the classical Protestant views, right, you might say. So there's the Protestant Reformation, and you get the Reformed over here, and then within the Reformed world, there's the split between the Calvinists and Arminians, and they go back and forth talking about that. Although the original Protestants would have been the Lutherans. We could talk about like Hussites or whatever, but on the soteriological questions we're discussing today would be the Lutherans. So who is a Lutheran superhero? Well, I actually didn't think of this one on my own, and I have to give credit to a commenter on my original post, but I think this analogy works well. Thor basically is the Lutheran view of predestination and salvation. Lutherans have been criticized for having an unintelligible or kind of a mysterious-filled version of soteriology, but they would, in one sense, say that our salvation is not based off of a foreseen faith, so they disagree with the Arminians in that sense. But they also wouldn't say that God reprobates anybody or passes over anybody in the same way. So they would agree with the predestination element of Calvinism, but they would say that people can lose that. So what's a good analogy for this position? And the Lutheran position is often called single predestination. There are some who object to that articulation, but There are interesting nuances to the Lutheran view, and of course there's interesting nuances to all the views that I won't get into today because I'm using overly simplistic analogies to compare them to superheroes, but for somebody who doesn't know where to start, I think this will help. Thor, I think, is a good example of the Lutheran view. Thor didn't do anything to earn his powers. He was just born as an Asgardian. They're, in a way, his birthright. In a sense, in the Lutheran soteriology, this is comparable to, say, single predestination, which is that you don't deserve to be elected. Or also the Lutheran view of baptismal regeneration, right? It's something that happens to you as a birthright, an inheritance that you receive as a child. But Thor can lose his powers by his pride. So when he becomes undeserving of Mjolnir, his hammer, it doesn't work anymore, and he has to be restored to his original righteousness before Mjolnir will work again. And so, in a sense, you could say, he can lose his birthright, and then it's returned to him by repentance. And so, once he repents, Mjolnir will come back to him, and it will work, and he's a superhero again. Also, a little fun fact, I guess, would be that Lutheranism is popular in Scandinavian countries, right? And Thor is a Scandinavian superhero. So I think that can kind of help articulate, hopefully, the main, let's say, Protestant views on soteriology. All of the Protestants also would agree that our salvation is by faith alone, but that isn't as much of what's at question here exactly in these conversations about predestination and soteriology. On the other side would be the what we could call ecclesialist or non-Protestant traditions, so Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism. What do they say about this? Well, Eastern Orthodox had a council called the Council of Jerusalem, where they agreed to the Confession of Dositheus, and it's basically a kind of non-Protestant version of the Arminian view, let's say, but the difference would be that in the Confession of Dositheus, it specifically does say that we are saved by faith and works, where an Arminian would say that that's not how it works. So a good analogy for the kind of Arminian non-Protestant view that is articulated by the Eastern Orthodox would be Green Lantern. Green Lantern receives his powers by an unmerited gift, in some sense, right? The Green Lantern ring, chooses worthy recipients, but he didn't create the ring, right? Let's say he's not Iron Man. Iron Man is not on this list. We'll talk about maybe that where he would go otherwise later, but he doesn't create the ring. He receives it as a gift from God. But in order for the ring to work, he has to use his power of will to sustain it. And the stronger that his willpower is, the stronger the ring is. If he decided to use his powers for some other purpose, he could become a yellow or red lantern, let's say in the analogy, and apostatize. And so the Eastern Orthodox would say that you can receive grace, and if you don't keep up your state of grace, and you don't cooperate with God, you can lose your salvation and become wicked. So I think that's another great analogy, hopefully, that can help people understand the different views. There's also what's been called the Molinist position. Now, there's a lot of people who consider themselves Protestants, like William Lane Craig, who have adopted this position. But originally, the Molinist position was a Roman Catholic position. The Cardinal Molina was trying to answer this question of predestination in a way that wasn't Calvinistic. So, infamously, Thomas Aquinas and Scotus and a lot of the early medieval scholastic theologians of the Roman Catholic Church basically give very similar answers to John Calvin on predestination. They would say that there is a mass of people who are reprobated, who God does not choose to elect. In Thomas Aquinas, this is called predilection. He passes over people and doesn't elect them. But also Thomas Aquinas' view is more complicated. It includes things like congruous and condign merit, which I won't be talking about in this video. It's not until after the Reformation that you get Cardinal Molina, I think is a cardinal, maybe Luis de Molina, whatever his title is, who articulates this Molinist view for the first time. And it's similar to the Arminian view and maybe the Council of Dositheus view with a couple of caveats. Molinism is basically posits a position called middle knowledge, which is that God will know all of the possible contraries to anything that he creates. And so he creates a world that is, in some sense, the best possible world, which includes gives everyone the best shot at accepting his grace, and he puts people in situations that he knows are best for them, and through his middle knowledge of knowing how they would react. And the people that he predestined from creation, he already foreknew are the people who would react to his grace. So it's still a combination of he gives everyone the best shot, but that still everything is within God's will, and he predestined everything to happen exactly as it's happening. The analogy that I think this can find in the superhero world is the Flash. Now, Flash has, and some of these characters also have alternative backstories or alternative versions of how their backstory runs. But in the Flash's backstory, it usually involves, spoiler alert for some pieces of media, but the Flash has an accident in a lab, or a seeming accident in a lab, which gives him his superpowers. But a lot of times it's actually articulated that this is actually an event of time travel, which happens because Flash will someday be the Flash, and he motivates either himself or one of his villains to go back in time and recreate the accident which created his superpowers. And so the criticisms of Molina, which is that God knows something that he didn't predestine, but that he did predestine, and it's like, what is he reacting to? Isn't everything within God's will? All these kinds of questions. This kind of temporal paradox criticism of Molinism also kind of relates to the Flash, right? Which is that if he never became the Flash, how would he have gone back in time to give himself his powers? And where does the beginning of this loop start and end, right? And so, in that sense, the Flash is the cause of his own powers, but he's also not the cause of his own powers, because in the time that he's receiving his powers, he's receiving it from someone who's not him. It's an interesting temporal paradox question that you could probably wrestle with, and so I think that it's best suited to the Molinist view of salvation. Okay, so the alternative boogeyman view that everyone would criticize, that was criticized originally by St. Augustine, would be the Pelagian view. Now, Pelagius was a heretic in the early church who argued that, yes, we receive grace sometimes, but really we choose, fundamentally, to be saved or not to be saved. And it is a human work about whether or not we're saved. And all of the other views that I'm articulated today, and the last one that I will articulate at the end, deny Pelagianism. The best analogy I have for Pelagianism, and I think there are actually a couple others as well, would be Batman. Batman never receives any superpowers as a gift. He never gets anything like that. But because of his own desire for justice, and through his own self-determination and wealth, he turns himself into a superhero. In a sense, he saves himself. Okay? Technically, Batman receives, in some times, unearned graces, but those graces aren't his superpowers. So think about his inheriting a vast family wealth. He does receive that, in some sense, as a gift that he didn't earn. But even without the vast wealth that he had, he could have still trained his body and done all the things to get to the place where he is to be a superhero. The same analogy would work for like Iron Man. But think about even like his the Robins. Robins don't have any superpowers. They've trained themselves. The oldest Robin, Dick Grayson, right, was an orphan and was just a gymnast and was super talented in that sense. And he made himself into a superhero. However, this is it's kind of fake, right? Because we call Batman a superhero, we call Robin a superhero, we call Iron Man, well, Iron Man, I guess, has some weird abilities that are unrealistic. But Batman isn't a superhero. He has a hero, and he has powers in some sense, but nothing out of the ordinary, nothing a normal person couldn't do. And of course, there are alternative Batman timelines where he gets other weird abilities and things, and I don't want to get into any of those right now. But at its base, Batman is not a superhero, and most people would agree that Pelagianism isn't a valid soteriology. It seems pretty clear in the Bible, say in Ephesians, Romans, that God predestines some for ultimate salvation purely by grace, and it's a gift that they couldn't have earned on their own. The final view, and the most complicated view, some people in the Protestant world would accuse Roman Catholicism of being Pelagian, but it's really not. And we'll explain why, is the position articulated at the Council of Trent. What was the Council of Trent? Well, the Council of Trent was the ecumenical council, according to the Roman Catholic Church, that reacted to the Protestant Reformation. So all of these different views were being introduced during the Protestant Reformation, and there was a an accusation coming from Protestants against the Roman Catholic Church that, well, all of your system of penance and your system of the treasury of merit, it really turns Roman Catholicism into Pelagianism. And so the Council of Trent articulated an alternative view. And I think the best analogy for the Council of Trent's view would be Goku. And I know Goku isn't technically like a comic book superhero, but he's got superpowers, and we'll talk about it, right? So Goku is powerful because of an unmerited gift, the fact that he is a Saiyan. So regular humans in the Dragon Ball universe can become powerful, but they can never approach Goku's power level or any of the other Saiyans' power levels, okay? Hercule, right? Yamcha. If you know who any of those people are, Krillin, they're not going to get close to Goku because they don't have this unmerited gift, which is the fact that he's an alien. But Goku also does work hard and has to work hard to achieve greater stages of his powers. The Roman Catholic view would be that you can grow in justification, right? Your justification is an inherent righteousness that can increase as you become more sanctified and more holy throughout your life. And in that sense, you can think of Goku attaining new Super Saiyan levels, right, through work. And there's a little joke on the slide, but it's true that in the Roman Catholic system, you also can work so hard, you do what's called work of supererogation. You do more than what God required of you, and then that extra work gets added to the treasury of merit, and the treasury of merit can be dispensed to other people to forgive them, remit them of their sins, and to remit them of the temporal debt of their sins that they would otherwise be paying in purgatory. You can see maybe why some critics would think this is like Pelagianism, where it involves a lot of you doing work, and you can work harder. You can work hard enough, right, to get extra bonus points, you might say, or pay the Pope to dispense someone else's bonus points for you. And in the Dragon Ball universe, I think the best analogy for this would be the hyperbolic time chamber, right, where it's Mr. Popo, and it's funny, right, Popo. Right, but Mr. Popo owns this super chamber where the time is really slow in the time chamber. So, or I guess it's really fast. So people going into it can work extra hard, and then on the outside, right, not as much time has passed. In a sense, right, you can get this whole double effect, indulgences, treasury of merit effect out of that. And so that is a broad sweep of the various soteriological or salvation or predestinarian positions of the Christian denominations. And you might say, well, what about the Baptists? What about Wesleyans and all these other kinds of things? Most of the other traditions, even within traditions, fall into some of these categories. So John Wesley, who's the founder of Methodism, was an Arminian. Particular Baptists, so if you've heard of a London Baptist Confession of 1689, would have been Reformed. They would have been Calvinistic, even though they weren't Reformed, period. They weren't Presbyterian, let's say, or Dutch Reformed. The Assyrian Church of the East, the Oriental Orthodox, tend to agree with the Council of Dositheus, even though they're not Eastern Orthodox. Again, variety of different views can be found within lots of denominations. Pentecostals tend to be Wesleyan as well, which means that they end up being Arminian. There are other questions here, right, like entire sanctification, which I haven't addressed, but this video is mainly focused on the various views of predestination from these different theological camps. Hopefully it was helpful. If you liked it, like the video. You can subscribe, and you can see more of the stuff that I do here on the Young Anglican channel. I usually talk about Anglican theology, and today I didn't talk about Anglicanism that much, but Anglicans have been historically permitted the Arminian view, the Calvinist view, and the Lutheran view. Within Anglicanism, you can subscribe to either any of those positions. But if you do want to know more about Anglicanism, if you want to know what my position is, what does Joe think? I have a video on my thoughts on predestination as well, and that's a more in-depth a treatment of the various predestinarian views. Hopefully I'll have it linked in the description. Other than that, though, if you if you agree, if you disagree, if you have an idea for an alternative superhero and where they would fall into these different categories, you can always put that in the comment section below. If you want to support me, you can always support me over at younganglican.locals.com. Thanks so much for watching, and God bless.